Sometime back over on the Infinite Investment Game YouTube channel, he made a video that looked at the difference between hype-driven demand and organic demand in the sports card market. You should definitely check out his video and subscribe to his channel. I really liked his exploration on this topic, and I thought I'd make a video on that same topic as well, as I think it's a really important point for everybody to consider. So let's get into this. Now first, let's define what I mean here when I say hype-driven demand and what I mean when I say organic demand. Hype-driven demand is the kind of demand that comes from some exciting moment. Maybe a player has some historic kind of game or string of games. Maybe a player becomes the talk of ESPN for whatever reason, like Zion did as he entered the NBA. Maybe a player leads his team on a really amazing playoff run. Whatever the source, hype-driven demand is the kind of demand that comes from exciting things that are happening like right now. Usually hype-driven demand is temporary, almost always. When hype-driven demand causes a spike in sports card values, it almost always is shortly thereafter followed by a dip of comparable measure. Sometimes the dip can even last for a really long time. I remember, for example, at one point Trae Young's cards saw a really significant hype spike, but once the hype died down, his cards have just kept dipping, and at a rate much sharper than the overall sports card market dip, I would suggest. Hype-driven demand is the kind of demand that might offer some possible plays on the market if you time things well and are able to sell when hype is high, but it also presents one of the most risky plays, because once the hype spike wave finishes, it'll almost inevitably crash hard, and you want to be off that wave before that happens. Otherwise, you may find yourself crushed against those metaphorical rocks. Organic demand, on the other hand, is something else entirely. Organic demand is a slower, more gradual thing. Organic demand is rooted in more long-established interest and historical significance. Organic demand comes when a player becomes solidified into the narratives within the sport and within the sports card community. When a card has entered the subconscious of the collector community and just kind of always remains there. Organic demand isn't something that really goes away. Its roots are deeper. It's not the kind of demand that changes too much based on anything that may happen in this moment. Sometimes it can change a little bit here and there, but for the most part, it's not so affected by the day-to-day occurrences. I mean, it still will ride the waves of the market, but not to such extreme highs and extreme lows. Cards with organic demand still do have ebbs and flows, but the peaks and valleys of those changes are hills or like slight inclines. They're not mountains. Vintage cards, for example, are kind of like the king of organic demand. They're cards that have been in demand for a very long time and likely always will be part of the narrative in some way or another. That's a pretty strong organic demand. In different contexts, there's also going to be different kinds of organic demand. I mean, if you're selling cards in Portland, you know, there's going to be an organic demand for Damian Lillard. If you're selling them in China, there's going to be organic demand for Yao Ming or Tracy McGrady or a few other players. This is another kind of organic demand that is regional driven. Now, even though everything I'm saying here could sound kind of like hype-driven demand bad, organic demand good, I don't mean it to sound quite that cut and dry. It's just they're very different things and need to be approached in very different ways. The excitement of hype-driven demand and the potential for profit, if you can time things well, makes for a hobby space that's attractive to many. And the safer, calmer waters of organic demand makes a space less hectic and more appreciated by many. There's plenty of room for both of these kinds of things in the hobby. I'd even suggest that both kinds of things are needed for the other to thrive. But I do think it's important for people to understand the difference between the two and recognize when something that is happening in the sports card market is a result of hype-driven demand and when something is caused by organic demand. The two different scenarios will very likely play out very differently over time. During the sports card value spikes of 2020 and 2021, hype-driven demand was everything. The entire market was hyped. Every single piece of short-term related advice given by every single person was resulting in short-term profit because everything was going up. It was impossible not to win. But once that hype-driven demand hit the peak of its wave, whoever was left still surfing on that wave, they were the ones left to crash against those rocks. Since the entire market was riding a hype wave, this was inevitable. But way too many people didn't recognize this inevitability, and thus a lot of people lost a lot of money. Hopefully, this is something we can all now learn from. Hype-driven demand does not sustain. So when making decisions into the future, it's essential to reflect on whether the demand that exists for any card you may be considering purchasing is hype-driven or if it's organic. Organic demand doesn't always remain static. It too can increase or decrease over time, but it is not such a frantic thing. If a card with organic demand does see a decrease in demand over time, likely it's a slow sort of thing, giving you opportunities to move on from the card if you so choose. And if you do lose money on it, likely it'll be less. Hype-driven demand, when it dips, it can dip fast and heavy, and if you haven't moved on from that card quick enough, you risk losing a significant amount of value in a very short amount of time. And now putting all of this into perspective into the current moment right now, where the sports card market has been dropping for a number of months now, this becomes an extra important thing to keep in mind. We likely haven't yet seen the bottom of this market dip yet, and though there still are plenty of opportunities for profit even in a market like the one we're in right now, in an overarching sense, the overall market is still going down. But right now, and over the next bit of time, if you can recognize opportunities for cards that always have real organic demand and you have the possibility of buying them at or near the bottom of the market, I'd suggest it's worth considering. Hype-driven cards in this market, not so much, because by the time the market does start to recover, that hype is likely going to be gone. So right now, I think, is a prime moment to be focusing on cards that have organic demand, but that are lower in price than they've been before. Not financial advice here, but this is just my way of seeing things at this particular moment in time, which is kind of a unique moment. Hope you enjoyed the video. Peace.